Carol Ann Doherty was a bright, cheerful 5th grade student at St. Mark's Roman Catholic School in Bristol Borough, Pennsylvania. She was said to be an avid reader with a particular interest in mystery novels. Born in 1952, the 9-year-old girl lived with her parents, Frank and Dorothy Doherty, and her younger sister, Kay, at their home on Manor Circle in Landreth Manor, a quiet residential neighborhood. Frank worked as a print shop foreman for the Bristol Printing Company, providing a stable income for his family. Dorothy was a devoted mother who maintained their household and ensured her daughters were well cared for. The family was deeply Catholic, attending St. Mark's Roman Catholic Church regularly and enrolling Carol Ann in the parish school. This strong religious foundation shaped Carol Ann's daily life and routines, including her habit of stopping to pray whenever she passed a church, a practice actively encouraged by the nuns who taught her. Kay, Carol Ann's younger sister, was only about 3 years old at the time of the incident. Despite her young age, Kay would carry vivid, traumatic memories of that terrible evening for the rest of her life. She remembered being placed in the car with her parents as they searched for her missing sister, and she would never forget the sounds of grief and anguish her parents made. Monday, October 22nd, 1962, began as a warm and unremarkable autumn day. The pleasant weather made it an ideal day for children to go out and play or ride their bicycles through the neighborhoods. For 9-year-old Carol Ann, it seemed like a perfect afternoon to visit the library and return the mystery book she had just finished reading. That afternoon, she returned home from school via the bus. Once home, Carol Ann's thoughts immediately turned to her library books. She had finished reading 2 novels in the Judy Bolton mystery series. These books had completely absorbed Carol Ann's attention, and she was eager, almost impatient, to continue the story. She gathered the books and prepared for her bicycle trip to the Bristol Borough Free Library, located approximately a mile from her home. She was dressed in blue slacks and a white blouse. After getting her new books, Carol Ann planned to meet 2 friends who were also reading the same series. It was approximately 3 o'clock to 3:30 p.m. when Carol Ann left her home, beginning what should have been a routine 15 to 20-minute bicycle trip through streets that she knew well. Witnesses later documented her movements with precision, allowing investigators to construct a detailed timeline of her final journey. Her first stop was Jerome's Market, where the owner saw her pass by on her bicycle. She was heading in the expected direction toward the library, pedaling steadily on her bike with no sign of distress. The girl continued to Tommy's Cafe on Farragut Avenue, a local establishment where children frequently stop to purchase small treats. At Tommy's, Carol Ann purchased a Coke and candy that cost only a few cents. She then continued her journey, turning onto Lincoln Avenue. This street ran adjacent to her church, and as she approached it, she made the decision to stop and go inside to say a brief prayer before continuing to the library. She left her distinctive blue and white Londoner racing bike outside the main doors of St. Mark's Church, with both of her books still fastened to it. Carol Ann entered the church through the main doors, stepping into what should have been a place of safety and peace. However, this was the last time she was seen alive. Investigators would later determine that Carol Ann was assaulted almost immediately after she entered the church, sometime around 3:35 p.m. It's stated that the entire event was only a matter of minutes, but in that brief time, Carol Ann was forcibly swept to the choir loft from the main floor and brutally assaulted and murdered. The loft was located on the 2nd floor of the church, accessed by a staircase that led up from the main sanctuary. The landing at the top of these stairs, just before entering the actual choir area, was where Carol Ann's body would be found. This location was beneath a stained glass window that cast colored light across the space, a beautiful feature that would become forever associated with tragedy. Investigators examining the crime scene determined that the girl had been raped. Her slacks and blouse had been partially removed, exposing her body. Her right shoe and sock had been taken off and were found at the scene. It was determined that the sock had moisture on it, indicating that it was used as a gag, effectively eliminating Carol Ann's ability to call for help. The method of murder was determined to be strangulation using some form of cord, belt, or similar object that was tightened around her neck. Bruises were visible on her neck where the ligature had been applied with fatal force. There were also bruises on her thighs, consistent with a violent assault and struggle. Additionally, clutched tightly in Carol Ann's hand were hairs belonging to a man. Investigators later noted that there were no signs that anyone had passed by the church or heard anything suspicious during the attack. Investigators carefully examined whether the body showed signs of having been dragged up the stairs to the loft from the main entrance, but found no such evidence. This suggested that the victim may have been lured up the stairs by her attacker. The crime scene itself was located on a landing that, according to some of the original investigators, was dusty and had accumulated various debris over time, including multiple hairs from different sources. This would later create complications for the forensic analysis, as investigators had to determine which hairs were relevant evidence from the attack and which were simply environmental contamination. However, the hairs found clutched in Carol Ann's hand were clearly distinct from random environmental hairs and were recognized immediately as critical evidence. When the girl failed to return home by 4:30 p.m. for dinner, her parents immediately knew something was terribly wrong. Carol Ann was a responsible child who was always punctual and would never worry her parents by being late without explanation or permission. They immediately went out searching for their missing daughter, driving through the streets and retracing the route they knew she would have taken to the library. As they drove along Radcliffe Street, Dorothy spotted her daughter's bike placed outside the church. Dorothy then went inside the church herself to search for her daughter. She entered through the main doors and looked around the ground floor of the church, calling out for Carol Ann, checking the pews and the sanctuary area. However, she did not go up the stairs to the loft during this initial search. When she failed to find her daughter on the main floor, Dorothy returned to the car where her husband Frank and their 3-year-old daughter Kay were waiting. She informed Frank that Carol Ann's bicycle was definitely outside the church, but she couldn't find her anywhere inside. Frank decided to conduct a more thorough search himself. He entered the church and, after checking the main floor as his wife had done, decided to climb the stairs leading to the choir loft to search the upper level of the church. It was approximately 6:00 p.m., roughly 2.5 hours after Carol Ann had been murdered, when Frank reached the top of those stairs and made the discovery that we just previously discussed. Kay would recall 63 years later the terrible noises her father made when he returned from the church, sounds of anguish and despair so profound they didn't seem like they could come from a human being. Frank rushed down from the choir loft, his mind reeling from what he had just witnessed. He desperately pleaded with his wife not to go into the church, not to see their daughter in her current state. He located Monsignor E. Paul Baird, the church pastor, and told him, "I think my daughter is dead." After accompanying Frank back to the church, Baird called the police. Unbeknownst to Carol Ann, as well as her parents and to everyone in Bristol Borough, a predator with a documented history of sexual assault was living less than a 5-minute walk from St. Mark's Church. This man would later be identified as William Shrader, a 22-year-old employed at the Century Tool Company in Croydon. Witnesses would later report seeing a suspicious stranger outside the church around the time of Carol Ann's disappearance. One neighbor specifically reported seeing the suspect, who was unknown to him, outside the church around 4:30 p.m. shortly after the estimated time of the murder. Other witnesses described seeing a man with a distinctive facial scar who, quote, looked like he just committed a murder, a description that matched Shrader's appearance. However, in January 1963, approximately 2.5 months after the murder, an eyewitness came forward to police to report that he had seen Shrader at the church on the day of Carol Ann's death. This witness had not immediately reported what he had seen, which was not uncommon for the time since many people were hesitant to involve themselves in investigations unless absolutely necessary. When Shrader was called in for questioning by investigators, he denied any involvement in the murder. He claimed that he had been at work at the Century Tool Company on the day of the murder and said he hadn't punched out until about 4:30 p.m., an alibi that, if true, would have placed him at work during the time of the incident. However, when investigators checked Shrader's time card at Century Tool Company, they discovered his alibi was a complete lie. The time card showed that he had checked out at 1:58 p.m. on October 19th, 1962, 3 days before the murder, and didn't return to work until October 24th, 2 days after Carol Ann's death. He had been completely unaccounted for during the critical time frame when the crime was committed. Confronted with this evidence that proved he had lied about his whereabouts, Shrader changed his story. He claimed that he had been installing a motor in his car at Gross's junkyard on October 22nd and had finished the job the next day. Police trooper Curtis W. Guyette checked with James Gross, the owner of the junkyard, but Gross couldn't recall whether Shrader had been at his establishment on those specific days or not. Shrader then provided a hair sample for comparison with the evidence found at the crime scene. He was also administered a polygraph test in the initial investigation. According to reports, Shrader failed the polygraph test. However, polygraph results from that era were not considered definitive evidence and were not admissible in court. Despite these multiple red flags, investigators in 1962 did not have sufficient evidence to charge the suspect with the crime. The forensic technology of the era was simply too limited to definitively link the hair evidence to Shrader, and without additional concrete evidence or a confession, prosecutors did not believe they could secure a conviction. Realizing he was under serious suspicion for the murder, Shrader made a decision that would later be viewed as highly incriminating evidence of consciousness of guilt. In January 1963, approximately 2 months after the murder and shortly after being questioned by police, Shrader fled Pennsylvania. He initially moved to Florida, where he remained for about a year before relocating to Texas and eventually settling in Houma, Louisiana, where he would spend most of the rest of his life. He was originally from Luzerne County, Pennsylvania, and displayed criminal behavior even in his youth. His childhood was marked by assaults against young girls, leading to his placement in a reform school. After his time there, Shrader joined the United States Army, but his military service was short-lived. He was dishonorably discharged after approximately 1 year of service. Following his discharge, he was convicted of attempted murder in the shooting of another man in Luzerne County. He served time at the Eastern State Penitentiary in Philadelphia before his release. After his release from prison, Shrader moved to Bristol to live with his brother and sister-in-law. It was during this period, while living on Lincoln Avenue near the church, that Carol Ann was murdered. As the investigation into Shrader's background deepened over the decades, a horrifying pattern emerged. Investigators determined that Shrader abused nearly every female child he lived with or had access to, including his own biological daughter and granddaughters. The majority of his victims were between the ages of 6 and 13 years old. Shrader also abused 2 adult women who had cognitive disabilities that rendered them unable to consent. But it should be stated that Shrader's criminal violence extended beyond assault. On October 31st, 1970, Halloween night, Shrader committed another murder that would eventually lead to his conviction and imprisonment. Around 10 p.m. that evening, a fire destroyed the house he and his family were renting in Louisiana. Inside the home at the time were Shrader's wife, Audrey, her daughter from a previous marriage, Elizabeth, and Elizabeth's 9-year-old friend, Catherine Smith. Catherine died as a result of injuries sustained in the blaze. Elizabeth suffered permanent brain damage while Audrey was hospitalized but survived without major injury. Initially, fire investigators could not definitively determine the origin of the fire, though arson was not ruled out. The case remained dormant until June 1985, when police detectives received information that the fire had been deliberately started by Shrader. Experts re-examined the burned-out remains of the house, and at least one expert concluded the fire had been intentionally set. Shrader was then indicted for the murder of Catherine Smith. The case went to trial, and although he was charged with first-degree murder, the jury convicted him of the lesser offense of manslaughter. He was sentenced to 21 years imprisonment at hard labor in a Louisiana prison. He remained imprisoned until his death in 2002 at the age of 62. In 1994, more than 3 decades after Carol Ann's murder, Bucks County convened a grand jury to investigate the case. By this time, advances in forensic science had made it possible to conduct more sophisticated analysis of the physical evidence collected in 1962. The hair sample collected from William Shrader was subjected to microscopic analysis in 1993. The results showed significant similarities to the hair found clutched in Carol Ann's hand. Critically, of the hair samples collected from 176 men over the decades of investigation, 141 were tested and all other individuals were eliminated. Shrader was the only person who could not be eliminated. However, this hair comparison evidence, while highly suggestive, was not considered sufficient to secure a conviction. The technology of the early 1990s could establish similarities and eliminate suspects, but could not provide the definitive identification that modern DNA analysis can achieve. Two primary suspects were brought before the 1994 grand jury, Father Joseph Sabadish and Shrader. Shrader, who was serving his sentence in Louisiana for Catherine Smith's death, had to be extradited to Pennsylvania to appear before the grand jury. Both Sabadish and Carol Ann's father, Frank, testified before the grand jury. When called to testify, Shrader invoked his Fifth Amendment right against self-incrimination and refused to answer questions that could incriminate him. Both suspects were administered polygraph tests and, surprisingly, both passed. Without sufficient evidence to indict either man, the grand jury concluded without bringing charges, and Shrader was returned to Louisiana to continue serving his sentence. This outcome was devastating for Carol Ann's family and the investigators who had worked tirelessly on the case. Frank and Dorothy would both pass away without ever knowing who killed their daughter, carrying that burden of uncertainty to their graves. Under District Attorney Jennifer Shorn's leadership, Bucks County convened a new investigative grand jury to review all evidence in the Carol Ann case and potentially bring it to closure. In an attempt to utilize the most advanced forensic technology available, investigators sent DNA evidence to Othram Laboratories in the Woodlands, Texas, approximately 1 year before the public announcement. But unfortunately, the samples were too degraded for successful profiling. Then in November 2024, a major breakthrough occurred in the case. Investigators from the Bucks County District Attorney's Office and Pennsylvania State Police interviewed Robert LeBlanc, William Shrader's stepson. What Robert revealed would prove to be the missing piece that tied together decades of circumstantial evidence. Robert told investigators that his stepfather had confessed to him on 2 separate occasions that he had murdered a little girl in a Pennsylvania church. According to Robert's statement, Shrader specifically told him that he, quote, lured the girl inside the church and her, and that he had to kill the girl in Bristol to keep her from talking. The credibility of LeBlanc's account was considered extremely high since he had no prior knowledge of specific details about the case. The details he provided could only have come from someone with direct knowledge of the crime. The Bucks County investigating grand jury conducted an exhaustive review of all evidence accumulated over 63 years. On October 27, 2025, President Judge Raymond F. McHugh, who supervised the grand jury, approved a comprehensive 53-page report detailing the investigation's findings. The grand jury formally found that William Shrader committed the crimes of rape and murder in the first degree in connection with Carol Ann Doherty's death. These findings were then publicly announced on October 29, 2025. The grand jury investigation also definitively eliminated the 3 other initial suspects. A man named Frank Zucchero confessed to the crime, but this confession was deemed completely unreliable given his intellectual limitations and inability to provide accurate details. Another man named Wayne Roach had a verified alibi placing him out of state, and his hair sample did not match the evidence. Father Joseph Sabadish's alibi, while initially false due to his extramarital affair, was ultimately confirmed by witnesses who saw him purchasing lingerie in Humeville Borough at the time of the murder. On the morning of September 2, 1984, 2 boaters made a grim discovery while venturing on the Narrow River in Narragansett, Rhode Island. Floating in the river was a distinctive floral patterned sleeping bag that had been tied with rope and weighted down with a cement cinder block. When authorities arrived and examined the sleeping bag, they found the body of a young woman inside. The victim was identified as 24-year-old Debra Stone, a resident of Cranston, Rhode Island. The Rhode Island State Medical Examiner conducted an autopsy and determined that Stone's cause of death was asphyxiation due to strangulation. The medical examiner's findings revealed significant damage to Stone's neck that was consistent with manual strangulation, ruling out other potential causes of death such as drug overdose. Debra was said to have been struggling with substance addiction at the time of her death. This addiction would ultimately lead her into contact with the man who would take her life, a notorious substance dealer operating out of Johnston. According to witness statements, Stone was last seen alive on the night of August 28, 1984, though some sources indicate August 29th as the definitive last sighting. Family members and friends reported that on this night, Stone had traveled to Johnston to visit an apartment complex where Robert D. Jeremiah, also known by the alias Bobby Myers, resided. This would be the last time Stone's friends and family would hear from her. By August 30th, Stone had effectively disappeared, though some witnesses would later claim, incorrectly as it turned out, to have seen her alive on that date. By the mid-1980s, Robert had established a reputation as a person to be feared. When questioned by investigators in 1984, he provided a self-serving account of the events surrounding Stone's visit to his apartment. According to Robert's statement, Stone had arrived at his apartment on the night of August 29th, asking to barter or exchange a stolen watch for substances. Robert claimed that he did not have anything available at that time. He then told police that after this brief interaction, he had driven Stone back to her apartment in Cranston, presumably dropping her off safely. He suggested to investigators that Stone must have died from an overdose after he left her. Crucially, his account included some details that investigators were able to corroborate through independent evidence. Witnesses confirmed that Stone had indeed taken a cab to Robert's apartment complex. Additionally, evidence supported that Stone had possession of a stolen watch when she arrived. These corroborated elements of Robert's story initially gave his account some credibility and made investigators hesitant to immediately identify him as the primary suspect. The investigation took a dramatic turn in 1986, 2 years after the murder, when a crucial informant came forward to police with shocking information about what had really happened to Debra Stone. This informant, whose identity has been protected but who would later be described by investigators as credible and willing to cooperate, provided investigators with a detailed and chilling account of the events of late August 1984. The informant told police that he had been present at Robert's apartment on the night of August 29th. According to his testimony, he witnessed Debra Stone, quote, gurgling on a bed that night. This suggested she was in the process of dying or had just been killed. Even more damning, the informant admitted that he had helped Robert move Stone's body from the apartment the next day. According to his account, he and Robert moved the corpse, placed it inside a floral sleeping bag, tied it with rope, weighted it with a cement cinder block, and disposed of it in the narrow river by dropping it from Middle Bridge. The statement included specific details about the disposal process that matched undisclosed evidence from the crime scene. This matching of crime scene evidence to the informant's account provided strong corroboration of his testimony. Additionally, the informant was able to confirm elements of Robert's original statement to police, including that Stone had taken a cab to the apartment and that she had been in possession of a stolen watch. Beyond the informant who helped dispose of Stone's body, investigators developed at least one additional witness who provided additional devastating testimony against Robert. This second witness told police that she had encountered Robert shortly after Debra Stone's death. During this encounter, according to the witness, Robert directly told her that he had to kill Stone because she was stealing from him. When confronted with the news reports that Stone had been strangled to death, Robert reportedly insisted to the informant that Stone had merely overdosed, maintaining his false narrative. Despite the compelling testimony from the informant who helped dispose of Stone's body, the extra witness statements, the physical evidence from the crime scene, and the medical examiner's conclusion that Stone was strangled, the case stalled and eventually went cold for nearly 4 decades. The primary reason for this failure was a polygraph test administered to the main informant. In the mid-1980s, when this investigation was active, polygraph tests were commonly used by law enforcement despite ongoing scientific debates about their reliability. Police subjected the main informant to a polygraph test to verify his account of the events. The critical question was whether he had witnessed Robert killing her. The informant was uncertain about whether Stone was already dead when he first saw her gurgling on the bed or whether she was in the process of dying. This uncertainty was reflected in the polygraph results. The informant failed the polygraph on this specific question about his presence during Stone's death. This failed test became the main reason the prosecutor and investigators did not believe they had enough basis to proceed with charges against Robert. On February 21, 2007, police officers responded to a welfare check at an apartment on Waterman Avenue in North Providence, Rhode Island. The building manager had grown increasingly concerned because he had not seen or heard from 49-year-old tenant Cynthia McKenna for several days. When officers entered McKenna's apartment, they discovered her unresponsive in her bed. The scene immediately suggested foul play. McKenna was found tucked tightly in her bed with 2 pillows over her face, wearing only 1 blue sock. Upon closer examination, investigators made horrifying discoveries about how McKenna had died. Another blue sock had been stuffed deep into her mouth and down her throat. White tissues had been carefully inserted into both of her nostrils, and she appeared to have a broken nose with bloodstains around it. The Rhode Island State Medical Examiner conducted an autopsy and determined that McKenna's cause of death was asphyxia due to obstruction of the airway. The case was officially ruled a homicide. Interestingly, there were no signs of forced entry anywhere in the apartment. The television was on at a low volume and there was prepared food in the kitchen. There was no evidence of a struggle inside the residence. These details strongly suggested to investigators that McKenna had been killed by someone she knew and trusted, someone she had voluntarily let into her home. McKenna was a mother of 3 children and a grandmother of 1. She had been living alone in her North Providence apartment on Waterman Avenue. By all accounts from her daughter's later statements, McKenna was a loving and devoted mother who cherished the small moments with her family. The investigation into the murder revealed that McKenna's adult life was complicated by her relationship with Robert J. Corey Jr. McKenna's friends told investigators that despite her fear of Corey due to his history of assaulting her, she still cared for him. The fact that McKenna had filed domestic violence charges against Corey in 2005 demonstrates that she recognized the danger he posed and wanted to protect herself. However, when she failed to appear in court, the charges were dismissed, and Corey faced no consequences. This failure to follow through with prosecution meant that the legal system did not intervene to protect McKenna, and the abusive relationship continued. McKenna's apartment manager had been forced to change the locks on her apartment because she reported being at odds with Corey, indicating an escalation between their conflicts. Yet somehow, Corey was able to gain entry to her home. Whether she let him in voluntarily or he found another way inside remains unknown. Corey, who sometimes went by the nickname Gunner, was a disabled Marine Corps veteran who had served in the United States military, including deployment during the Persian Gulf War. Corey's life after the Marines was marked by heavy substance involvement and multiple troubled relationships with women. He and McKenna began dating around the mid-2000s, and the financial pressures that came with their substance addictions ultimately played a role in the motive toward McKenna's murder. The specific substances that Corey abused are not detailed in most public reporting, though the confession letter he later wrote referenced prescription pills, specifically mentioning that McKenna had allegedly attempted to steal pills from him. This reference to pills suggests that Corey's drug involvement likely included prescription medications, possibly pain medications, or other controlled substances. As previously mentioned, Corey was seeing other women while maintaining a relationship with McKenna. One of these other women would later become a major witness in the investigation. Police believe that Corey confessed to McKenna's murder to one of these other women with whom he was involved. The fact that Corey felt comfortable enough to admit his involvement in McKenna's death to another romantic partner suggests he may have been seeking understanding, forgiveness, or perhaps boasting about his actions, patterns not uncommon among perpetrators of homicide cases involving romantic partners. The existence of multiple concurrent relationships also suggests that Corey may have been unfaithful to McKenna, which could have been yet another source of conflict between them. For McKenna, who friends described as both fearful of Corey and caring for him, the knowledge that he was involved with other women may have been emotionally devastating while simultaneously offering hope that he might leave her alone if his attention was directed elsewhere. As you'd expect, Corey was one of the first people that detectives questioned in regards to the incident. He provided an alibi regarding his whereabouts at the time of McKenna's death, but as detectives worked to verify his account and establish his movements during the period between February 18th and February 21st, they identified significant gaps and inconsistencies in his statements. while investigators could place him at the Knights Inn in New Bedford from February 14th through February 19th and could confirm his presence at VA hospitals on February 19th, there were periods of time during those days when Corey's location and activities could not be accounted for. These gaps were particularly significant because investigators determined that McKenna was likely killed on or around February 19th. The fact that Corey could not provide a solid, verifiable account of his whereabouts during this exact time frame raised serious suspicions. However, suspicions alone, even when combined with motive, history of violence, and witness testimony about threats, were not sufficient to charge Corey with murder in 2007. Approximately 1 month after McKenna's murder, detectives brought Corey in for formal interrogation regarding the homicide. By this point, officials had gathered enough witness testimony pointing to Corey as the culprit, and they were aiming to use this opportunity to expose him. During the interrogation, investigators challenged Corey with the various discrepancies they had identified in his statements about his activities and whereabouts during the relevant time period. However, despite the inconsistencies in Corey's statements and the circumstantial evidence that had accumulated, detectives determined they lacked sufficient probable cause to arrest him at that time. The key problem was that investigators had no physical evidence directly linking Corey to the crime scene. The DNA evidence from the assault kit had revealed no foreign DNA. The fingernail clippings contained only McKenna's DNA, and the sock and tissues used in the suffocation had yielded insufficient DNA for comparison. On another note, after McKenna's death, one of Corey's friends reported a disturbing observation to the police. The friend stated that he had seen Corey in possession of items that the friend believed belonged to McKenna. This witness account suggested that Corey may have taken possessions from McKenna's apartment, though investigators were unable to definitively prove this connection during the original investigation. During their extensive witness interviews, investigators developed information that led them to believe Corey had confessed to McKenna's murder to one of the other women with whom he was involved. This belief would later be partially confirmed when authorities intercepted letters that appeared to be written by Corey. These letters were discovered about 8 months after the incident. There were 2 letters and 1 envelope. One of the intercepted letters was dated October 24th, 2007. In this letter, the writer made what appeared to be a direct confession to McKenna's murder, though written in a way that attempted to minimize culpability. The writer stated, "I have not been doing good at all since I did that to that crackhead. I did not mean for her to die. If she hadn't attempted to steal pills from me, it would not have happened. I know North Providence would love to nail me, so I have to be careful." Furthermore, these letters provided a male DNA profile. However, Corey's own DNA was not registered in the index system, so they were unable to test their evidence against Corey. In January 2009, forensics experts conducted a handwriting analysis comparing samples of Corey's known handwriting to the writing in the intercepted letters. Their conclusion was that it was probable that the letters and Corey's writing samples shared a common author. While this handwriting analysis provided some support for the theory that Corey had written the confession, the conclusion was not strong enough. Without conclusive proof that Corey had authored the letters, prosecutors determined they could not charge him with McKenna's murder. Fast forward to August 4th, 2014, Corey died at the age of 52. He passed away 7 years after McKenna's murder and 11 years before the case would be conclusively solved. But in 2024, using YSTR testing on DNA from a direct relative of Corey's as well as the retained DNA from the letter, officials were able to develop definitive answers. As per Assistant Attorney General Baum, it was stated that the testing results showed definitive proof that Corey was the one who wrote the confession letters. On October 29th, 2025, Attorney General Peter Noronha held a press conference to announce that the Cynthia McKenna murder case had been conclusively solved. Attending the conference was Cynthia McKenna's daughter, Jacqueline, who delivered an emotional statement about what the closure meant to her and her family. She stated, "For 18 years, 8 months, and 9 days, I have mourned my mother, and although my quest for justice may have fluctuated, it has never ceased. Today there is accountability, and today we begin the healing process. A mother of 3, a grandmother of 1, she deserved so much more. Her life mattered and always will. My heart isn't suddenly whole again. The truth doesn't magically restore her. Her absence has always been magnified during the major milestones in my life, but it's in the small day-to-day moments where all is quiet that I miss her the most.